Some roads end in heartbreak before they ever lead to hope. On a hot summer evening in 1881, a young woman stepped off a stagecoach carrying everything she owned in one battered suitcase and every dream she had left inside her heart. She had traveled across half of America chasing a promise of marriage, a home, and a future. But within minutes of arriving, she discovered that promise had already been given to someone else. Alone in a strange western town with nowhere to go and almost no money left, she stood on the edge of losing everything. What she could not know was that a quiet rancher watching from across the street was about to offer her something far greater than the future she had imagined. Before we continue, welcome to Legend of West. If you enjoy emotional Western stories filled with romance, second chances, and unforgettable journeys, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications now. Many viewers forget to subscribe and later cannot find the stories they loved most. Join the Legend of West family today, so you never miss the next chapter. Nell Carter stepped down from the stagecoach and immediately felt the stillness beneath her feet. After days of rattling roads and endless travel, the solid ground felt almost strange. The town of Silver Ridge, Colorado, stretched before her beneath a golden evening sky. Dust drifted through the air while horses stood tied outside wooden buildings lining the main street. She adjusted her simple brown traveling dress and tightened her grip on the worn leather suitcase that held everything she owned. Inside were 2 spare dresses, a hairbrush, a small Bible, and an old notebook filled with recipes her mother had written before her passing. Nell scanned the small crowd gathered near the station. She searched for the face she had imagined countless times during her journey. Theodore Briggs, the man whose letters had promised her a new life in the West, yet he was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a nervous young man approached her, removing his hat awkwardly. "Miss Carter?" he asked. Nell nodded. "I am." The young man swallowed hard. "My name is Henry. I work for Mr. Briggs." Something in his expression immediately made her stomach tighten. "Where is Mr. Briggs?" she asked quietly. Henry looked down at the ground. "He asked me to speak with you." The answer alone told her everything. The hope she had carried for months suddenly felt fragile. Henry finally forced himself to continue. "Mr. Briggs sends his apologies, ma'am. He married another woman 3 weeks ago." For a moment the sounds of the town seemed to disappear. Nell simply stood there as the words settled into her chest. Married another woman. After months of letters. After inviting her west. After promising her a future. Henry held out an envelope. "He asked me to give you this." Nell accepted it without opening it. She already knew what it contained. Money. A payment to ease his conscience. A few dollars to make abandonment seem polite. "I understand," she said calmly. Henry looked surprised by her composure. "I'm very sorry, Miss Carter." Nell offered a small nod. "Thank you for telling me." She turned away before he could see the disappointment burning behind her eyes. She would not cry here. She would not break apart in front of strangers. Her parents were gone. Their farm back in Ohio had been sold years ago. There was no home waiting for her. This journey had been her last chance to build a future. Now even that had vanished. Across the street, a tall rancher had witnessed the entire exchange. His name was Wyatt Reed. He had come into town for supplies and happened to be standing outside the general store when the conversation unfolded. Wyatt was a man of few words. At 35 years old, years of ranch work had carved strength into his broad shoulders and weathered face. He watched the young woman carefully. Most people would have broken down. Most would have shouted or cried. Yet she simply stood there with dignity, absorbing the blow without complaint. Something about that caught his attention. Wyatt understood loss better than most. 5 years earlier, he had buried his wife after a sudden illness. Since then, his ranch had fallen quiet. His elderly father, Samuel, had slowly surrendered to grief, spending most days confined to his room. The house felt empty despite the people living inside it. Wyatt had spent months trying to keep everything together, But he was exhausted. He could handle cattle, horses, and harsh winters. What he could not handle was a home that no longer felt alive. Watching Nell stand alone on that dusty street, an idea formed in his mind. It was practical, simple, perhaps exactly what both of them needed. He crossed the street and stopped several feet away. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. Nell turned toward him. Her blue eyes were steady despite the hurt hidden within them. "My name is Wyatt Reed. I couldn't help overhearing." She waited silently. "It seems you're in need of work." Nell studied him carefully. "And why would that concern you?" A faint hint of respect appeared in Wyatt's eyes. "Because I'm in need of help." He folded his arms. "My ranch is 5 miles north of town. My father is ill and the house has been neglected for too long. I need someone who can cook, clean, and help keep the place running." Nell remained cautious. She had trusted one stranger already. "What are you offering?" Wyatt answered immediately. "Room, board, and $12 a month." Nell raised an eyebrow. The offer was generous, more generous than she expected. "And your father?" she asked. "What's wrong with him?" Wyatt looked toward the distant mountains. "The doctor says his body is weak. I think it's his spirit that's sick. He hasn't cared much about living since my wife passed away." Nell considered everything carefully. The future she had imagined was gone. The road behind her offered nothing. This offer wasn't romance, it wasn't marriage, but it was honest work and a chance to stand on her own feet. Finally, she extended her hand. "Very well, Mr. Reed, I'll accept." Wyatt shook her hand firmly. "Then welcome to Silver Ridge, Miss Carter." As come, the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Neither of them realized that this simple agreement would become the beginning of a story neither one had expected. The ride to the Reed Ranch took nearly an hour. As the wagon rolled across the open plains, Nell sat quietly beside Wyatt and watched the western landscape unfold before her. Endless fields stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening breeze carried the scent of grass and pine. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. Wyatt seemed like a man who spoke only when necessary, and after the day she had endured, Nell found she appreciated that. Eventually, a cluster of buildings appeared in the distance. A sturdy ranch house stood beside a large, red barn surrounded by fences and grazing cattle. The place was well built but carried a strange stillness that immediately caught Nell's attention. It looked less like a home and more like a place people had simply learned to survive in. When they arrived, Wyatt carried her suitcase to the front porch and opened the door. The moment Nell stepped inside, she understood what he meant. The house was clean enough, but it felt empty. Dust lingered on shelves. The curtains were faded. The furniture sat exactly where it belonged, yet nothing about the room felt welcoming. There were no flowers, no decorations, no signs of laughter or warmth. It was a house that had forgotten how to be a home. "Your room is down the hall," Wyatt said. "It isn't much, but it's comfortable." Nell followed him to a small room with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the pasture. After placing her suitcase inside, Wyatt pointed toward the kitchen. "The pantry's stocked. Use whatever you need. My father stays in the last room at the end of the hallway. Most days he doesn't come out." Nell nodded. "I'll do my best." Wyatt hesitated briefly. "That's all anyone can ask." After he left to finish evening chores, Nell unpacked her belongings and then walked into the kitchen. The room had potential. The stove was old but sturdy. Pots and pans hung neatly from hooks. Shelves held flour, beans, potatoes, onions, and salted meat. She rolled up her sleeves and immediately got to work. By nightfall, a fire crackled inside the stove and the scent of fresh biscuits filled the air. She cooked a simple meal of beef, potatoes, and gravy. When Wyatt returned, he stopped in the doorway and inhaled slowly. It was probably the first real home-cooked meal the ranch had smelled in years. They ate quietly at the table. Wyatt thanked her after every dish she passed him, a small gesture that revealed more about his character than long conversations ever could. After supper, Nell prepared a plate for Samuel Reed and carried it to the old man's room. She knocked softly. No answer came. She knocked again. Still silence. Finally, she placed the tray outside the door and returned to the kitchen. Next morning, the food remained untouched. Nell removed the cold meal without complaint and began her work. Over the following days, she transformed the house piece by piece. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, repaired curtains, and planted herbs outside the kitchen window. Most importantly, she cooked. Every morning, the aroma of fresh bread drifted through the house. Every afternoon, soups and stews simmered on the stove. Every evening, the dining table held meals, prepared with patience and care. Slowly, the ranch began to feel different. Even Wyatt noticed it. He started lingering at the table after meals instead of immediately returning outside. Their conversations remained brief, but grew more frequent. He told her stories about the cattle drives he had joined as a younger man. Nell shared memories of her childhood in Ohio and the recipes her mother had taught her. Day by day, the awkwardness between them faded. One morning, Nell discovered a crate filled with fresh firewood beside the kitchen door. She knew Wyatt had placed it there so she wouldn't have to carry heavy logs herself. The next day, she baked an extra loaf of bread and left it wrapped on the table for him. Neither mentioned the gestures, yet both noticed them. Nearly 2 weeks passed before anything changed with Samuel Reed. On a cool autumn afternoon, Nell prepared a large pot of beef stew using herbs from her garden. The rich aroma filled every corner of the house. Potatoes, onions, carrots, and tender chunks of beef simmered together for hours. Wyatt sat at the table repairing a saddle while Nell stirred the stew. Suddenly, a sound echoed down the hallway. Both of them froze. The sound came again. Slow footsteps. Weak, but unmistakable. Wyatt immediately stood. Neither spoke as the footsteps grew closer. Then a frail figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. Samuel Reed stood there gripping the frame for support. He looked thin and pale, but his eyes were alert. For several seconds, nobody moved. The old man ignored both of them and stared directly at the pot on the stove. He inhaled deeply. Then another breath. Finally, he spoke in a rough voice that sounded unused after months of silence. "Who made that stew?" Nell lowered the spoon. "I did, Mr. Reed." Samuel continued staring at the pot. "Smells like something my wife used to cook." Wyatt looked stunned. It was the longest sentence his father had spoken in months. Samuel slowly shuffled toward the table and lowered himself into a chair. His gaze never left the stove. "Could I have a bowl?" he asked quietly. Nell smiled for the first time all day. "Of course." As she served the stew, Wyatt watched the scene unfold with disbelief. For months, doctors had failed to help his father. Friends had failed. Time had failed. Yet somehow a woman who arrived with a single suitcase and nowhere else to go had managed to bring the old man out of his room. Samuel tasted one spoonful. Then, another. Soon he was eating steadily. The room remained silent except for the sound of his spoon against the bowl. But something had changed. For the first time in years, the Reed family table no longer felt empty. And as Wyatt glanced across the table at Nell, he realized the stranger he had hired out of necessity was becoming far more important than either of them had expected. From that day forward, Samuel Reed began leaving his room more often. At first, it was only for meals, but soon he started spending entire afternoons sitting near the kitchen stove while Nell worked. Sometimes he watched her knead bread dough. Sometimes he listened as she hummed old songs she remembered from childhood. Other times he simply sat, quietly with a cup of coffee in his hands, enjoying the warmth that had slowly returned to the house. The change amazed Wyatt. For nearly 5 years he had watched grief consume his father piece by piece. Nothing had been able to reach him. Yet somehow Nell had done what nobody else could. She had reminded him that life was still worth living. Autumn settled across the valley. The trees turned gold and crimson, while cooler winds swept across the plains. The ranch remained busy, but now Wyatt found himself looking forward to coming home each evening. The moment he opened the front door, he was greeted by the scent of supper and the sound of conversation instead of silence. One evening after dinner, Samuel leaned back in his chair and studied the two younger people sitting across from him. A knowing smile appeared beneath his gray mustache. "You two spend more time watching each other than talking," he said. Nell nearly dropped her fork. Wyatt cleared his throat and focused very hard on his coffee cup. Samuel chuckled softly. "Thought old age had stolen my eyesight, didn't you?" Nell felt heat rise to her cheeks, while Wyatt fought an embarrassed smile. It was the first genuine laugh the old man had shared in years. As the weeks passed, the friendship between Nell and Wyatt deepened naturally. Neither rushed it. Neither spoke of feelings. Yet countless, small moments began connecting them. Wyatt repaired a loose step outside the kitchen before Nell could mention it. Nell mended a torn shirt she noticed hanging in the laundry room. When winter storms approached, Wyatt made sure extra firewood was stacked beside her door. When he returned late from long days working cattle, she always kept a hot meal waiting. Their care for one another became woven into everyday life. Then one snowy afternoon, everything nearly changed. Wyatt had ridden into town for supplies. Hours passed and darkness began falling. Yet he did not return. A powerful storm swept across the valley, bringing fierce winds and heavy snow. Nell stood at the window watching the growing darkness with increasing concern. Samuel noticed her pacing. "He's been through storms before," the old man said. "I know," Nell replied quietly, "but this one feels different." Another hour passed, then another. Finally, near midnight, the sound of hooves echoed outside. Nell rushed to the door and threw it open. Wyatt sat slumped in the saddle, covered in snow. His horse stumbled into the yard. Without hesitation, Nell ran through the storm toward him. Together, she and Samuel helped him inside. Wyatt's face was pale from cold and exhaustion. He had become stranded miles away when his wagon broke, an axle. For hours he had fought through the blizzard to get home. Nell stayed beside him through the entire night. She brought blankets, hot coffee, and warm broth. Every time Wyatt opened his eyes, he found her sitting nearby. Near dawn, the storm finally eased. Wyatt looked at her and managed a weak smile. "You should get some sleep." Nell shook her head. "Not until I know you're all right." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Wyatt reached out and gently took her hand. "Nobody has worried about me like this in a very long time," he said softly. Nell's heart skipped. She realized then that somewhere between the first meal she cooked and the countless ordinary days that followed, she had fallen in love with him. Not because he was handsome, not because she needed saving, but because he was kind, honest, dependable, and good. Wyatt looked into her eyes and seemed to reach the same realization. A quiet understanding passed between them. Neither needed words. A month later, on a bright winter morning, Samuel stood beside the fireplace watching Wyatt nervously straighten his collar for the 5th time. "If you're going to ask the girl to marry you," Samuel grumbled, "you'd better stop pacing before you wear a hole through the floor." Wyatt laughed. "You make it sound easy." "It is easy," Samuel replied. "You love her. She loves you. The rest is just talking." Later that evening, Wyatt found Nell standing outside watching the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains gold. He walked beside her and took a deep breath. "Nell," he began. She turned toward him. "When you arrived here, I thought I was offering you a job. Truth is, you gave this ranch something it lost a long time ago. You gave my father his life back. You gave this house warmth again. And somewhere along the way, you gave me mine too." Nell felt tears gathering in her eyes. Wyatt reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring. "I don't have fancy speeches. Never have. But I love you, Nell Carter. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life proving it." For a moment, she could not speak. Then she smiled through her tears and nodded. "Yes, Wyatt. Yes, I will." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the last light of the setting sun shone across the valley. The woman who had arrived in Silver Ridge with nothing but heartbreak and a worn suitcase had finally found what she had traveled so far searching for, not through promises written in letters, but through kindness, patience, and a love that grew slowly beside a warm kitchen stove. And inside the ranch house, Samuel Reed smiled to himself as the scent of fresh bread drifted through the air, knowing that sometimes the greatest miracles arrive when life seems to have reached its end. Thank you for listening to this story on Legend of West. If this journey touched your heart, be sure to subscribe, because the next unforgettable Western romance may become your favorite story yet.